Ancient knowledge can outlast empires when it is woven into the world itself. For centuries, the enigmatic Druids served as the spiritual and intellectual guides of the Celtic peoples, guarding a profound wisdom they believed was too potent for parchment and ink. They committed every sacred law, every stellar secret, and every healing herb to memory alone, a living library meant to vanish with them, yet whispers of their world did not die. This journey will reveal how fragments of their secret knowledge survived conquest and conversion, hidden within the very fabric of our folklore, etched into silent stone circles, and carried on in the quiet rituals of the countryside. You will discover the hidden code within old poems, the reason a simple well was once a portal, and how the turning of the seasons holds an ancient truth. What forgotten wisdom might still be waiting, quietly, in the landscape around you. To understand the survival of their secrets, we must first meet the Druids as they truly were. They were not solitary hermits in misty forests, but the central pillars of Celtic civilization. In a world without universities or written law, they served as the living repositories of all essential knowledge. A single Druid could be a priest interpreting the will of the gods, a judge settling tribal disputes, a poet preserving generations of history in epic verse, and an astronomer tracking the complex cycles of the moon and stars. Their training was famously rigorous, often said to last 20 years, because every sacred ritual, every legal precedent, every healing remedy, and every ancestral story had to be memorized perfectly. This was a conscious choice. They believed that true wisdom, especially that which connected humanity to the divine and the natural world, was too dynamic, too powerful, to be frozen on a dead page. It had to live in the breath, in the spoken word, passed directly from teacher to student. This is the great paradox that creates our mystery. A tradition built on perfect oral transmission, designed to leave no physical trace, faced the Roman conquest and later the spread of Christianity. According to Roman generals like Julius Caesar, who encountered them in Gaul, and naturalists like Pliny the Elder, the Druidic orders were systematically dismantled. Their sacred groves were cut down, their practices banned. With the teachers gone, it would seem their vast library of memory simply vanished into silence. So when we find echoes of their world centuries later, it begs a powerful question. If they wrote nothing down, what whispers could possibly have slipped through the cracks of time, and where did they hide? This absolute reliance on memory was their greatest strength and their ultimate vulnerability. They saw writing as a kind of spiritual trap. To carve sacred words into wood or scratch them onto wax was to remove the living spirit from the knowledge, to pin it down like a butterfly, beautiful but dead. True wisdom, they believed, flowed and changed like a river, adapting to the listener and the moment. It required the nuance of a human voice, the spark of direct transmission from a knowing mind to a ready one. This is why their training was so famously long and intense, sometimes spanning 2 decades. A student didn't just memorize lists of herbs or laws, they internalized a complete worldview. Through relentless recitation, poetic meter, and song, the information was woven into the very fabric of their consciousness. The knowledge became a part of them, as inseparable as their own heartbeat. This created a living library, but one that burned when the library burned. So when the Roman legions marched through their sacred groves and the new Christian priests built churches on their old meeting grounds, the formal chain of master-to-student transmission was brutally severed. The organized Druidic orders as a powerful social class were dismantled. It appeared to be a total erasure, yet this is where our search becomes a detective story. If the formal teachers were gone, where did the lessons go? The answer lies not in grand institutions, but in the quiet persistence of everyday life. The secret knowledge did not vanish, it simply transformed. It went underground, seeping into the soil of folklore, disguising itself in children's rhymes, hiding in the rituals of the harvest, and whispering from the old stories told by the hearth fire on a long winter's night. The living library closed its doors, but its books were quietly reprinted in the language of the land and its people. But when one door of memory closes, another often creaks open. Into this silence stepped a different kind of keeper, the bard. In the old Celtic world, bards were not merely entertainers. They were the lower-ranking but vital cousins to the Druids. Where the Druid handled the sacred and the cosmic, the bard was the master of story, of lineage, and of praise. Their duty was to remember. They memorized the genealogies of kings stretching back generations, the heroic deeds that defined a tribe's identity, and the intricate laws of the land, all composed in complex, rhythmic poetry. When the structured Druidic orders faded under pressure, the bardic tradition, perhaps seen as less threatening or more purely artistic, found ways to endure, especially in the remote corners of Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. These poets became the unexpected guardians of the fragments. They carried forward not just historical facts, but the very structures in which deeper wisdom might be hidden. Think of them not as authors, but as skilled librarians who preserved the empty, beautifully crafted bookshelves, long after the original books were taken away. The shelves themselves hold a clue. One of the most fascinating survivals is found in early Welsh literature, in a form known as the triads. These are concise, memorable statements grouped in sets of 3. A typical triad might list the 3 noble stocks of Britain, or the 3 unfortunate councils of the Isle. On the surface, they are simple catalogues. But that structure, the rule of 3, echoes everywhere in Celtic thought and likely back into Druidic teaching. 3 realms of land, sea, and sky. 3 aspects of the poetic art. 3 stages of truth. The triad format is a perfect mnemonic device, a mental filing cabinet. By forcing knowledge into groups of 3, it made vast amounts of information easier to memorize and transmit orally across centuries. But could these lists be more than just memory aids? Some scholars see them as a philosophical shell. A triad stating the 3 pillars of bardism might be learning, truth, and the love of goodness. This isn't just a list, it's a condensed ethical code. The rhythmic, cryptic language of bardic poetry itself may have acted as a protective layer. By encoding ideas in metaphor, kennings, and strict meter, the knowledge became accessible only to those trained to listen beyond the literal words. A poem about a king's battle might also, to a knowing ear, describe the movement of stars or the struggle for spiritual balance. The bard became the custodian of a cryptic inheritance, preserving the outer forms, the poetic rhythms, and the triadic patterns that once housed the Druids' inner teachings. In their verses, the secret knowledge didn't shout, it whispered, waiting for a time when its deeper echoes could be heard again. These poetic patterns found their greatest sanctuary in a collection of medieval Welsh tales known as the Mabinogion. Written down by Christian scribes between the 12th and 13th centuries, these stories are far older, their roots digging deep into a soil rich with pre-Christian belief. On the surface, they are tales of kings and heroes, of love and betrayal and magical adventure. But look closer, and you begin to see a different world shimmering beneath the text, a world that scholars argue preserves the very shape and feel of Druidic cosmology. Take the story of Branwen, daughter of Lur. It features a magical cauldron with the power to restore the dead to life, though they return forever silent. This is not a simple plot device. The cauldron is a profound symbol, echoing archaeological finds of ritual cauldrons in Celtic lands and speaking to a deep belief in regeneration, in a cycle of life, death, and rebirth that was central to the old naturalistic faiths. The tale follows a journey to the otherworld, a realm that exists alongside our own, accessible through certain mounds, lakes, or mist-shrouded islands. This isn't the Christian heaven or hell, it's a parallel dimension of eternal youth and feasting, a core tenet of Celtic spirituality that the Druids would have understood intimately. Then there is the enigmatic figure of Ceridwen, a sorceress from another tale. Her story is a direct window into the pursuit of sacred knowledge. Ceridwen possesses a cauldron in which she brews a potion of inspiration, for a full year and a day to grant her son ultimate wisdom. The potion is accidentally consumed by a young boy named Gwion Bach, who, after a shape-shifting chase, is reborn as the great poet Taliesin. This narrative is dripping with symbolism that mirrors Druidic initiation. The year and a day brewing period mirrors the cyclical, seasonal understanding of time. The transformative chase and rebirth of Gwion into Taliesin symbolize the death of the old self and the awakening of the inspired, enlightened mind. The onslaught is the Welsh concept of flowing, divine inspiration, directly comparable to the Irish imbaz, the poetic frenzy that Druidic seers were said to cultivate. Here, in a medieval manuscript, we have a coded recipe for spiritual awakening. The Christian scribes who recorded these stories likely saw them as fascinating folklore or noble history, but in doing so, they inadvertently preserved the vessels, the cauldrons, the journeys, the transformations, that once held the living waters of Druidic thought. The pagan worldview survived not by confrontation, but by disguise, woven into the very fabric of captivating stories told for generations around the hearth. While the Welsh stories preserved a hidden cosmology, across the Irish Sea, an even more direct echo of the Old World was being committed to vellum. Ireland, never conquered by Rome, became a fortress for native tradition. Here, the complex spiritual system that once guided the Druids didn't just hide in folklore. It was systematically recorded by a new class of Christian monks who were also the heirs of their own Gaelic past. They wrote down the great cycles of myth, and in these texts, the line between ancient priest and medieval poet becomes beautifully, mysteriously blurred. The most ambitious of these collections is the Leber Gabála Érenn, the Book of Invasions. It presents a grand, poetic history of Ireland, populated by successive waves of mythological settlers, from the people of the goddess Danu to the mighty Milesians. This isn't factual history, but something far more revealing. It is a sacred geography, a story that ties the sovereignty of the land itself to the gods and goddesses who shaped it. Reading it, you are not learning dates, you are absorbing a map of divine power, a testament to how the pre-Christian Irish saw their home as a living entity intertwined with supernatural history. This worldview finds its fierce, dramatic heart in the Ulster cycle, centered on the epic Táin Bó Cúailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley. It's a sprawling tale of heroes, rivalry, and a magical bull, but its spiritual mechanics are operated by figures who are the clear successors to the Druids. They are called the Fillid. More than poets, the Fillid were seers, judges, and advisors, holding a high social rank that directly mirrored the Druidic office. They were trained for years in complex oral verse and possessed a form of divination known as dichetal ducheneb. This phrase, meaning incantation from the ends of the bones, describes a state of inspired, spontaneous prophecy. It was knowledge that came not from study, but from a trance-like communion, a channeling of truth from the unseen world directly through the body. This practice is a powerful relic, a glimpse into the altered states of consciousness the old Druids might have used to seek wisdom. The characters in these myths move through a world governed by immutable natural spiritual laws. Consider the Morrigan, a goddess who appears as a crow on the battlefield, a washer at the ford, and a seducer of heroes. She is not simply a war deity, she is a personification of sovereignty, fate, and the terrifying, transformative power of the land itself. Her interventions decide kings and battles, reflecting a belief that human rule was only legitimate if blessed by the supernatural force of the territory. Then there is the concept of jays, a sacred personal taboo or prohibition. A hero might be under a jays never to refuse hospitality, or never to eat the flesh of a dog. To break one's jays was to invite cosmic disaster, an unraveling of personal destiny. This isn't mere superstition, it's a profound spiritual contract. Each jays binds an individual to a specific code of conduct that maintains their harmony with the otherworldly order. It is a law written not on stone, but on the soul, enforced by the very fabric of reality. What we see in these Irish cycles, then, is not just stories, but the preserved architecture of a complete, nature-bound spiritual system. The Fillid practiced its arts, the goddesses enforced its rules, and the heroes lived and died by its sacred prohibitions. The Druids may have left the stage, but in the dim scriptoriums of medieval Ireland, their worldview was being carefully, respectfully copied, ensuring its strange and potent logic would never be fully lost. Stone itself can sometimes speak in a language of lines and notches. Scattered across the Irish and Welsh landscapes, standing silently for over a millennium, are pillars marked with the cryptic strokes of the Ogham alphabet. At first glance, these inscriptions seem simple, even crude, just groups of straight lines carved along the edge of a stone, reading like a secret message meant for the stone itself. Traditionally, these markings are associated with the Druids, described as their secret magical script. But what if Ogham was never truly meant for writing in the way we understand it? What if its primary purpose wasn't to communicate with the living, but to act as a key for unlocking a far more ancient and complex library of knowledge? To find the answer, we must look past the stone monuments to the medieval manuscripts that sought to explain them, centuries after the Druids were gone. In texts known as the Briathar Ogham, or Word Ogham tracts, scholars preserved something extraordinary. Each of the 20 original Ogham letters is named for a tree or a plant, and each is given a poetic kenning, a riddle-like phrase that hints at its deeper meaning. The letter B, for example, is Beaith, the birch tree, described as Feoco's folchain, most silver of skin. The letter D is Dare, the oak, called Ardram Dwar, highest of the wood. These are not just descriptions. They are condensed poems, tiny capsules of lore. This system transforms the alphabet from a simple tool for spelling names into a sophisticated mnemonic device, a mental filing system of immense capacity. Imagine a trained scholar running a finger along the notches on a stone, or perhaps a wooden stave. Each set of lines calls to mind not just a letter, but a specific tree. And with that tree comes a cascade of associated knowledge. Its physical properties, the month it governed in the Celtic calendar, the medicinal virtues of its bark and leaves, the mythological creatures associated with its grove, and the spiritual qualities it symbolized, like protection, purification, or strength. The oak wasn't just a tree, it was the king of the forest, a symbol of sovereignty and durability, its wood sacred. The hazel meant wisdom and poetic inspiration, its nuts said to contain all knowledge. By memorizing the Ogham and its kennings, a person could effectively carry an entire encyclopedia of natural science, cosmology, and magic in their mind. This is where we see a potential, breathtaking survival. The Druids were renowned for their deep, sacred understanding of the natural world. They didn't just study trees, they communed with them, seeing them as pillars connecting the underworld, the Middle Earth, and the heavens. The Ogham alphabet, especially in its later elaborated form, may be a surviving skeleton of that arboreal science. It is a framework upon which the living flesh of Druidic knowledge, the songs, the properties, the seasonal rituals, could be hung and remembered. So those silent stones with their stark lines may not be grave markers or boundary signs alone. They could be the stone-bound roots of a vast, invisible tree of wisdom, its branches once alive in the memory of the learned, and its leaves whispering still in the poetic kennings of the medieval scribes who tried to capture its fading shadow. The silent language of Ogham reveals a world where every tree held a secret. This deep, sacred connection to the forest finds one of its most poetic expressions in what we now call the Celtic-tree-calendar. Popularized in the 20th century by the poet Robert Graves in his book The White Goddess, this calendar links each of the 13 lunar months in a year to a specific tree, each with its own Ogham letter and rich tapestry of meaning. While scholars debate the exact ancient origins of this precise system, its core idea resonates powerfully with everything we know about Druidic thought. It feels like a surviving echo, a structured reflection of a much older truth, that the Celts did not simply live among trees, they lived in conversation with them. To walk into an ancient oak wood was to enter a cathedral. The Druids called such a place a nemeton, a sacred grove. This was not merely a pretty cluster of trees, it was a consecrated space, a temple without walls where the veil between the human world and the spirit world was believed to be at its thinnest. Here, rituals were performed, wisdom was sought, and judgments were passed. The trees themselves were the pillars of this living temple, each species revered as a unique being with its own spirit and lesson to teach. This profound reverence, known as arborology, was likely the foundation of their natural philosophy. They observed the oak's stubborn strength, the willow's fluid grace by the water, the apple's generous fruit, and saw in them mirrors of human qualities and cosmic principles. The tree calendar, whether a perfect ancient system or a later poetic synthesis, beautifully codifies this worldview. It begins with the birch, associated with the new moon of the winter solstice, a time of purification and new beginnings. Its silver bark symbolized a clean slate, a chance to shed the old year. Following it comes the rowan, a tree of protection, its bright red berries seen as a charm against enchantment. Then the mighty ash, the tree of connection, linking the three worlds with its deep roots, strong trunk, and high branches. Each month tree carries this dual meaning. It is both a practical guide to the turning year and a spiritual lesson. The hawthorn marks the lush fertility of May, but also warns of the fairy realm's potent magic. The oak, ruling the time of the summer solstice, is the undisputed king, representing endurance, sovereignty, and the doorway to divine strength. The hazel, with its nuts of wisdom, governs the late summer month of knowledge and poetic inspiration. This cyclical journey through the trees maps a soul's journey through the seasons of life itself. The practical knowledge bound to each tree was immense and constitutes a direct strand of surviving wisdom. The Druids were master herbalists and naturalists. They knew which bark could reduce a fever, which leaves could heal a wound, and which berries were poisonous. The yew tree, associated with the final lunar month before the cycle begins again, is a perfect example of this deep, dual understanding. It is one of the longest living beings in Europe, often found in ancient churchyards. Its every part is toxic, yet from its bark came the first chemotherapeutic agents. It represents death, yes, but more profoundly, it symbolizes eternal rebirth. Its hollow, ancient trunk often sprouting new growth from within its own decay. This wasn't just botanical fact, it was sacred metaphor. This detailed knowledge of properties, for healing, for crafting, for ritual, did not vanish. It seeped into the folk medicine of the countryside, into the green lore of the village wise woman or cunning man. The recipes changed, the prayers might have been Christianized, but the core understanding that the willow's bark eased pain, or that mistletoe, the sacred plant of the oak, held potent magic, survived for centuries in oral tradition. So when we look at a chart of the Celtic tree calendar, we are not just looking at a quaint New Age invention. We are looking at a potential cipher, a later key that helps us unlock how the Druids might have organized their universe. It suggests they saw time not as a straight line, but as a spiral, moving through the living qualities of the forest. Their sacred grove was their university, their library, and their sanctuary. The trees were their teachers, their calendars, and their alphabets. In the quiet persistence of folklore that tells us to carry an ash twig for protection, or in the old herbal remedy that uses hawthorn for the heart, we are likely hearing the faint, enduring whisper of their arboreal wisdom, a secret knowledge that learned to hide not in stone or vellum, but in the very leaves and roots of the land itself. The forest's wisdom was always written in the cycles of light and shadow. To truly understand the Druids, we must lift our eyes from the trees and look to the sky, for their sacred knowledge was mapped across the heavens and mirrored in the most enigmatic monuments left on earth. Across Britain and Ireland, ancient stone circles stand as silent sentinels, their massive forms arranged with a precision that defies simple explanation. Sites like Stonehenge in England or Newgrange in Ireland were built thousands of years before the Celtic cultures even emerged. The Druids did not build them, but there is compelling reason to believe they became their inheritors. When the Celtic peoples arrived in these lands, they encountered these awe-inspiring structures already ancient, already humming with a powerful presence. It is almost unthinkable that their learned class, the Druids, who were the astronomers and philosophers of their society, would have ignored them. Far more likely, they adopted these sites, studying their alignments and weaving them into their own spiritual and calendrical systems. They would have recognized in those standing stones a shared language, a monumental echo of their own reverence for the celestial order. The survival of their astronomical knowledge, then, may be literally set in stone. Consider the Great Mound of Newgrange in Ireland. Built over 5,000 years ago, its most stunning feature is a narrow roof box above the entrance. For just a few minutes at dawn around the winter solstice, a beam of sunlight pierces this opening, travels down a long passageway, and illuminates the inner chamber in a dramatic burst of golden light. This is not an accident. It is a feat of profound engineering and astronomical observation, a way of marking the year's darkest point and the promised return of the sun. 1,000 years later, the Druids, with their deep understanding of solar and lunar cycles, would have understood exactly what this meant. They would have seen Newgrange not as a relic, but as a functioning instrument, a cosmic clock built by their distant predecessors. This knowledge of solstices and equinoxes was not lost, it was absorbed. It became the bedrock of their ritual year, but their calendar was even more nuanced. They divided the year not just by the 4 solar points, but by the 4 cross-quarter days that fall midway between them. These are the fire festivals deeply embedded in Celtic tradition: Imbolc at the start of February, Beltane at the start of May, Lugnasadh at the start of August, and Samhain at the start of November. These were not arbitrary dates. They marked the crucial turning points in the agricultural and pastoral cycle, the times for planting, for moving cattle to summer pastures, for harvesting, and for honoring the dead. Evidence suggests that some stone circles, like the complex at Callanish in Scotland, have alignments that point to the rising of certain stars or the moon's extreme positions, which would have helped pinpoint these important cross-quarter dates. This reveals a sophisticated, integrated wisdom. The Druids' calendar was a living bridge between the cosmic and the earthly, connecting the sun's journey with the lambing season, the harvest, and the descent into winter. The survival of this knowledge is evident in our very language and tradition. We still celebrate Halloween, a direct descendant of Samhain, and May Day echoes the old fires of Beltane. The stones themselves may not speak, but their alignments tell a story of a people who watch the sky to know when to sow, when to reap, and when to gather in sacred spaces to mark the eternal dance between darkness and light. This celestial rhythm, first observed by Neolithic builders and later curated by the Druids, is a secret that never truly died. It simply became the rhythm of the year itself, waiting for us to look up and remember. These celestial rhythms were not just observed, they were lived, celebrated in a cycle of fire and feast that has never truly been extinguished. The most direct, living survival of the Druidic world is not found in a manuscript or a stone, but in the turning of the year itself, marked by 4 great Gaelic festivals. Each one a hinge between seasons, they formed the sacred skeleton of the ritual calendar, and their continuous, unbroken celebration in folk tradition is a testament to knowledge too essential to ever be forgotten. We begin in the dark half of the year with Samhain, celebrated at the end of October and beginning of November. This was the Celtic New Year, a time of profound duality. The harvest was complete, the herds were brought down from summer pastures, and the world prepared for winter's sleep. But this moment of closure was also a moment of terrifying openness. It was believed the veil between the world of the living and the other world grew so thin that spirits, ancestors, and fairy folk could pass freely among the living. Great communal bonfires were lit, not just for warmth and light, but as beacons of protection in the supernatural dark. People would wear disguises or costumes, perhaps to confuse any malevolent spirits wandering abroad. Offerings of food and drink were left outside for the visiting dead. This was not a time of horror, but of solemn communion and necessary caution, acknowledging the intimate presence of the unseen realm. When Christianity spread, it did not erase Samhain, it layered upon it. The holy day of All Saints, followed by All Souls, was placed on the 1st and 2nd of November, sanctifying the time of the dead. The old bonfires became lanterns carved from turnips, later pumpkins, and the tradition of guising evolved into our modern Halloween. The ancient understanding that this was a time when world's touch has never faded. From the deepest dark, the wheel turns toward the first fragile promise of light, Imbolc, at the start of February. In the dead of winter, this festival honored the first stirrings of spring beneath the frozen earth. The name itself is thought to mean in the belly, a reference to the pregnancy of ewes and the soon-to-come lambing season, a crucial event for survival. This festival of gentle awakening was intimately tied to the goddess Brigid, a figure of fire, poetry, healing, and smithcraft. Her presence was invited into the home. People would craft Brigid's crosses from rushes or straw, protective symbols hung over doorways. A bed might be made for her by the hearth, and the ashes of the fire were carefully examined in the morning for signs of her blessing. Here, the survival is breathtakingly clear. As Christianity took root, the beloved goddess Brigid was seamlessly transformed into Saint Brigid of Kildare, one of Ireland's patron saints. Her feast day is celebrated on February 1st, the very day of Imbolc. The sacred fire she tended in her pre-Christian form was said to have been kept burning for centuries by nuns at her monastery. The making of Brigid's crosses continues in homes and schools across Ireland to this day, a direct, unbroken thread from a Druidic festival of renewal to a beloved modern saint's day. As the light strengthens, the land erupts into the vibrant fertility of Beltane at the beginning of May. This was the joyous gateway to summer, a festival of pure, unashamed life force. Its central symbol was fire. Great bonfires, kindled in a special way, were the heart of the celebration. Cattle, vital to the community's wealth, were driven between two such fires to cleanse and protect them for the summer grazing ahead. People would leap over the flames for luck, health, and fertility. Maypoles, with their brightly colored ribbons, were erected as symbols of the sacred union between earth and sky. Flowers were gathered, and doors were decorated with yellow blossoms like primrose. It was a time of courtship, of matchmaking, and of celebrating the potent creativity of the natural world. While the large communal fires may have dimmed, the essence of Beltane persists. May Day celebrations with flower crowns and dancing around the maypole are direct descendants. The old belief in the special magic of May Dew, collected at dawn for beauty and health, lingered in countryside lore for generations. The fire that once purified the herd transformed into the small, symbolic fires of later folk custom, a quiet echo of a once blazing celebration of life's return. Finally, the wheel brings us to the first fruits of all that groweth at Lugnisad, the festival of the beginning of August. Named for the god Lug, a master of all arts and skills, this was not a summer harvest thanksgiving, but a vibrant, communal celebration of the bounty to come. It was a time for great gatherings, for athletic contests, for horse racing, and for matchmaking. Trial marriages, called tell-town marriages, could be entered into for a year and a day. The first grains of the harvest were ceremonially cut, often with a special sickle, and the first loaves of bread from the new crop were baked and shared. It was a festival of the community's strength and skill, honoring the craftsmanship of the farmer, the blacksmith, and the artist alike. The Christian Harvest Festival, often held in late September or early October, absorbed this spirit of gratitude. But more directly, the old pattern of Lugnisad gatherings survived in the form of country fairs and Lammas festivals, a name derived from the Old English for loaf mass, echoing that sacred first bread. The emphasis on games, trading, and communal joy at the height of summer carries the unmistakable spirit of Lug's celebration. This unbroken chain, from Samhain to Imbolc, to Beltane, to Lugnisad, is perhaps the most powerful argument for the survival of Druidic knowledge. The Church may have renamed the days and dedicated them to saints, but it could not stop the turning of the seasons or the human need to mark them. The people simply transferred their ancient, essential rituals to the new holy days, preserving the when and the how of celebration. The fires still burned, the crosses were still woven, the first grains were still cut with ceremony. In these acts, performed year after year for centuries, the old calendar kept ticking. The Druids' profound understanding of the sacred year did not vanish into history. It stepped quietly into the shoes of folk tradition, continuing its eternal dance in the hearts and hands of the people who lived closest to the land. But the calendar was not the only thing that stepped out of the ancient groves and into the village lane. As centuries turned and the medieval world gave way to the early modern era, a new kind of figure walked the back roads and country lanes of rural Britain and Europe. They were known by many names: the cunning folk, the wise men and women, the charmers, or the conjurers. To their neighbors, they were essential, if sometimes secretive, members of the community. They were the ones you called when your cow's milk dried up for no reason, when a mysterious illness struck a child, or when a treasured piece of family silver went missing. They operated in a shadowy space, not as priests of the new church, but not as its declared enemies either. They were the practical problem solvers of the supernatural and the mundane, and in their quiet work, we may be seeing the most direct, living link to the fragmented folk knowledge of the Druids. These individuals were not part of any organized pagan religion, which had long since faded from public view. Instead, they were the keepers of a deep, localized, earth-based wisdom tradition. Their toolkit was one of herbs, spoken words, and an intimate familiarity with the spirit of the local landscape. A cunning woman might prepare a salve from yarrow and plantain to heal a wound, recite a specific charm whispered 3 times over a bowl of water to break a fever, or craft a simple talisman from rowan wood and red thread to protect a home from ill wish. They were herbalists, midwives, and diviners, their authority drawn not from scripture, but from perceived results and from a knowledge passed down, often within families, through an oral chain stretching back into the unrecorded past. What makes them such compelling candidates as heirs to a druidic legacy is the nature of their craft, particularly their use of the spoken spell. Their charms, often written down in later centuries in personal notebooks known as grimoires or spellbooks, reveal a fascinating syncretism. They would freely mix Latin prayers from the Christian liturgy, like the Pater Noster or the names of saints, with older, cryptic phrases that linguists have sometimes traced to corrupted Celtic invocations. A charm to stop bleeding might begin with a blessing to the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and then seamlessly weave in a line like bone to bone, sinew to sinew, vein to vein, an incantation whose rhythm and intent feel far older than the Church. This was not heresy to them, but practicality. They were drawing power from every available source, building a bridge between the new official religion and the old, stubborn ways of the land. Their knowledge was also profoundly local and observational, echoing the Druidic reverence for specific natural sites. A cunning man would know not just which herb to pick, but the precise bank where the most potent version grew, the phase of the moon when it should be harvested, and the proper words of thanks to speak to the plant as he took it. He would know the old standing stone in the field that was said to move at midnight, the spring whose water was best for eye ailments, and the ancient oak where the local spirits were thought to reside. This was a map of invisible power, written not on parchment, but on the living countryside. It was a practical, applied spirituality concerned with the immediate problems of life, health, and community harmony. While the grand cosmology of the Druids may have been lost, the core techniques of their craft, the verbal magic, the botanical mastery, and the sacralization of place, found a new, humble home in the cottage of the village wise woman. Operating on the margins of the accepted faith, these cunning folk became the unintended archivists. They preserved not a religion, but a methodology, a way of interacting with a world still seen as alive, responsive, and filled with unseen forces waiting to be respectfully addressed. That intimate knowledge of the local landscape held a very practical kind of magic, a deep understanding of the green world that kept communities healthy. The herbal wisdom of the cunning folk, passed down through whispered recipes and careful observation, almost certainly carries echoes of a far more ancient pharmacy. While we can never know the exact formulas of the Druids, their reverence for specific plants is well documented, and it points toward a fascinating way of seeing nature, one where every leaf and root carried a visible clue to its purpose. This is often called the doctrine of signatures. It is the idea that the natural world is a kind of symbolic book, and that plants, through their shape, color, or habitat, reveal their medicinal uses to those who know how to read them. A plant with yellow flowers might be used for jaundice. a kidney-shaped leaf for urinary ailments, and a root that resembles a human nerve might be used for neuralgia. While this concept was later formalized in medieval European herbals, its intuitive, symbolic logic fits perfectly within the Druidic worldview. They saw the entire cosmos as interconnected and communicative, where patterns repeated from the stars down to the smallest herb. To them, a plant's appearance wasn't an accident, it was a signature, a divine hint left by the intelligence of the natural world. This perspective turns a walk through the woods into a reading of a sacred text, where each plant is a page with a message. Several plants stand out in Celtic lore, their uses so specific and deeply woven into ritual that they strongly suggest a Druidic heritage preserved in folk practice. First and most sacred was mistletoe. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder gives us a vivid snapshot of a Druidic rite involving this strange plant, which grows not from earth but from the branches of a host tree, most reverently the oak. He describes white-robed priests climbing the sacred oak at an auspicious time, cutting the mistletoe with a golden sickle, and catching it in a white cloth before it touched the ground, lest its celestial power be lost to the earth. It was called the all-healer, a potent remedy for infertility and a charm against all poison. This reverence survived. For centuries in British and European folk medicine, mistletoe was used to treat epilepsy, nervous disorders, and tumors, a direct thread from its ancient title. Then there is vervain, a humble-looking herb known as the enchanter's plant. It was gathered at sunrise with great ceremony, often with an offering of honey left in its place. The Druids used it for purification, sweeping their ritual spaces with it, and it was a key ingredient in potions for prophecy and divination. This reputation endured. Vervain appears constantly in the charm books of the cunning-folk, used to wash doorways for protection, to brew teas for lucid dreaming, and as a general purifier. Its story is one of unbroken ritual use, from ancient seers to village wise women. Foxglove presents a more cautionary tale, showcasing the fine line between medicine and poison that the ancients understood well. Its beautiful bell-shaped flowers, Digitalis purpurea, contain powerful compounds that affect the heart. In tiny, carefully measured doses, it can regulate and strengthen a heartbeat. In excess, it is deadly. Folk names like witches' gloves or dead men's bells hint at this dual nature. While direct evidence of Druidic use is scarce, it is precisely the kind of plant their deep botanical knowledge would have mastered, using it with extreme caution for specific heart-related ailments. This dangerous knowledge survived in the countryside, with some cunning folk reportedly using minute amounts in complex preparations, a risky inheritance of a very old understanding. Finally, consider the oak gall, the hard, round growth formed on oak trees by wasp larvae. To the Druids, anything from the sacred oak held power. These galls, rich in tannic acid, were used as a powerful astringent for treating wounds, skin conditions, and as a base for inks. This practical use continued for centuries, with galls being a staple in both folk medicine and early monastic ink making. The survival of this herbal lore is a story of quiet transmission. When a grandmother taught her granddaughter to make a poultice of yarrow for a wound, or to brew chamomile for a restless child, she was passing on fragments of a knowledge system that once saw each plant as a living spirit with a story to tell. This cottage medicine was the daily, practical container for these secrets. And later, when antiquarians and folklorists in the 18th and 19th centuries began traveling the countryside, writing down the old cures and customs before they vanished, they were, in a way, performing the final act of preservation. They transcribed the oral tradition that had carried the Druids' green wisdom for 2,000 years, capturing the last echoes of a time when healing was a sacred conversation with a living, speaking world. The green world spoke not only of healing, but of hidden messages waiting to be decoded. For the Druids, divination was not mere superstition. It was a sophisticated language, a way of listening to the whispers of a conscious universe. They believed the divine did not communicate in thunderous proclamations, but through subtle signs woven into the fabric of everyday life. The flight pattern of a crow, the shape of a cloud at dawn, the sudden appearance of a hare crossing your path. All of these were considered omens, pieces of a vast, living puzzle. While their most complex rituals are lost to us, the fundamental methods they used, and the belief system behind them, survived for centuries in the folk practices of the countryside, suggesting a deep and persistent way of seeing the world. One of the most widespread survivals is the practice of augury, the interpretation of bird behavior. The Romans noted the Celtic fascination with birds, seeing them as messengers between the earthly realm and the otherworld. Specific birds carried specific meanings. The raven or crow was often a bird of prophecy in battle, its harsh call or direction of flight foretelling conflict or the arrival of important news. The wren, though tiny, was considered the king of birds in Celtic lore. Its movements sometimes consulted for secrets. This ancient attention did not vanish. For generations in rural Britain and Ireland, common superstitions held fast. To see a single magpie was considered an omen of sorrow, prompting the salute and greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Magpie," to ward off bad luck. The direction from which the cuckoo's call was first heard in spring could predict the weather or fortunes for the coming year. The sudden, silent flight of an owl by day was viewed with deep unease. These were not just quaint sayings, they were the fossilized remains of a once formal system of reading the avian messengers of the gods. Beyond the birds, the very sky itself was a page to be read, a practice sometimes called mnemomancy, or cloud divination. The Druids, as keen astronomers and observers of natural cycles, would have understood weather patterns as expressions of divine mood. The color of the sunset, the formation of clouds at a particular festival, the direction of the wind on a significant day, all held meaning. This translated into countless weather rhymes and farming almanacs that survived into the modern era. Red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in morning, shepherd's warning, is a perfect example. It is a practical observation born from experience, but it originates in a worldview where the sky's hues were actively communicating. The survival of haruspice, the examination of animal entrails, is more shadowy but hinted at in folklore. While the graphic ritual sacrifice described by classical authors faded, the symbolic examination of animals persisted. In Scottish and Irish tradition, the fae or seer might examine the shoulder blade of a sacrificed sheep, reading marks and cracks in the bone by firelight to predict events. This practice, known as scapulomancy, feels like a direct, simplified descendant of the more elaborate entrail reading of the ancients, a way of seeking the future written in the very substance of a sacred offering. Two more specific practices offer a startlingly clear window into this lost art of listening. The first is the Scottish Highland ritual known as Tag Hairm. This was a harrowing form of prophecy seeking, often conducted in remote, liminal places like a waterfall or a cave. The seeker would wrap himself in the fresh, warm hide of a recently slain bull or ox, and lie alone in the dark behind the falling water. There, in a state of sensory deprivation and heightened suggestibility, he would seek visions and answers. The name itself is thought to mean an echo or an answer. While the later versions of this became associated with summoning demonic voices, its core structure, of using ritual animal skin, and an in-between place to open the mind to otherworldly knowledge, feels profoundly archaic, a stark relic of Druidic incubation rites. The second and gentler survival is dream incubation at sacred wells. Across the Celtic landscape, certain springs and wells were revered as portals to the otherworld, places where the goddess or local spirit resided. The practice was simple but powerful. A person seeking healing or guidance would make a small offering, often a piece of cloth or a coin, to the spirit of the well. They would then drink or wash in the water and sleep beside it. The dream that followed was not considered an ordinary dream, but a direct message from the divine inhabitant of that place, offering a diagnosis for illness or a solution to a problem. This practice continued at Christianized holy wells for centuries, with the saints simply replacing the earlier deity. The act, however, remained unchanged, a quiet, personal form of divination that required no priestly intermediary, only faith in the communicative power of the sacred site. Together, these surviving fragments paint a compelling picture. They suggest the Druids mastered an entire grammar of the natural world. Birds were its punctuation, clouds its shifting script, and the entrails of a sacred animal its most cryptic text. The survival of these practices in folk superstition and localized ritual is not evidence of primitive fear, but of a persistent, intuitive truth that the world is not silent. It is in conversation. The old woman who reads the weather in the clouds, the farmer who notes the bird's behavior before a storm, and even our own slight unease at a solitary magpie, are all participating in the last, faint echoes of a druidic art, the art of hearing the universe speak. This conversation with the universe often flowed through water. In the Celtic world, no element was more sacred or more intimately tied to the spirit realm than water. Every bubbling spring, every deep well, every rushing river was seen not as a mere resource, but as a living, conscious entity, a doorway. This profound reverence left a mark on the landscape so deep that it never faded. It simply changed its name. Scattered across the hills and valleys of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Cornwall are thousands of sites known as holy wells. Today, they bear the names of Christian saints, like St. Brigid's Well in Kildare or St. Columba's Well on the Scottish Isle of Iona. But dig a little deeper into their history and local lore, and a much older story emerges. In almost every case, these were sacred sites long before the first missionary ever arrived. The early church, in its wisdom, did not try to stamp out this deep-seated veneration, it redirected it. They built a chapel nearby, or simply declared the well to now be under the protection of a particular saint. The water remained holy, the rituals continued, but the divine resident received a new title. This is one of the clearest, most visible threads of unbroken tradition we can still touch today. The rituals practiced at these wells for centuries are a direct window into pre-Christian belief. One of the most common is the offering. For ages, people have tossed coins into the water, a custom we still see in fountains today, though its original meaning has dimmed. This was not a wish for luck, but a gift, a payment or tribute to the spirit of the place in exchange for its blessing or healing. More poignant is the tradition of the clootie, a strip of cloth or rag. A person seeking healing, often for themselves or a loved one, would come to the well. They would first wash the afflicted part of the body with the sacred water. Then they would tie a piece of cloth, usually taken from the clothing of the sick person, onto a tree or bush growing beside the well. As the cloth slowly frayed and rotted away in the wind and rain, so too, it was believed, would the illness waste away. This act beautifully merges the healing power of the water with the transformative power of nature, a physical prayer left to decay in the elements. Another common ritual was circling the well, walking around it a specific number of times, often 3, or following a sunwise direction, moving with the path of the sun to attract positive energy. These practices were not random superstitions. They stemmed from a core druidic understanding of water as a liminal space. The word liminal comes from the Latin for threshold. It describes a place or a moment that is in between, neither one thing nor another, and therefore charged with magical potential. Dawn and dusk are liminal times. The shoreline where land meets sea is a liminal place. And a well, a spring bubbling up from the unseen depths below to break into the world of light above, was the ultimate liminal portal. It was a crack in reality, a point where the ordinary world and the other world seeped into one another. The water itself was seen as a conduit. To drink from a sacred well was not just to take in water. It was to ingest the wisdom and healing power of the other side. To sleep beside one, as in dream incubation, was to place your consciousness at that very threshold, hoping the inhabitants of that other realm would cross over and speak to you in your dreams. This animistic belief, that the natural world is alive with conscious, spiritual forces, could not be erased by decree. It was too deeply felt, too woven into the daily experience of people whose lives depended on the land's generosity. So when Christianity came, the wells were not abandoned. They were baptized. The old goddess or local spirit became a saint. The offerings continued, The prayers were adapted, and the circling rituals were tolerated. The sacredness of the place itself proved stronger than any change in doctrine. When you see a rag tied to a tree by a country well, or toss a coin into a fountain, you are participating in a ritual that stretches back over 2,000 years. You are standing at a threshold maintained by countless generations, a silent testament to a time when every spring was a whisper from another world, and every act of reverence was a way to answer back. That threshold of the sacred well opens onto a much larger landscape, a realm that existed alongside the everyday in the Celtic mind. This was the otherworld, known as Annwn in Wales and Tir na Og in Ireland. It was not a distant heaven or a grim underworld, but a parallel dimension of breathtaking beauty and perpetual youth, a fundamental layer of reality that could be accessed, often by accident, in the right place at the right time. The old tales are filled with these sudden crossings. In the early Welsh saga, the hero Bran Macfebel hears haunting music that lulls him to sleep. When he wakes, he finds a silver branch covered with white blossoms lying beside him. He sets sail to find the land from which it came, and after a voyage of wonders, he reaches the Isle of Women, a place of endless feasting and joy where time stands still. He stays for what feels like a year, but when homesickness drives him to return, he is warned not to set foot on his native soil. He ignores the warning, steps ashore, and instantly crumbles to dust, for centuries had passed in the mortal world. This story captures the essence of the otherworld. It is a realm of perfection that exists on a different time stream, intimately close yet governed by its own immutable laws. The Irish hero Oisin experienced this same temporal magic. He fell in love with Niamh of the golden hair, a woman from Tir na Og, and rode with her across the sea on her white horse. He lived there in happiness for 300 years, though it felt like only 3. When he longed to see his old comrades again, Niamh lent him her magical horse but made him swear he would not dismount. He returned to Ireland to find the Fianna long gone and everything changed. While trying to help some men move a stone, he slipped from the saddle. The moment he touched the earth, the weight of all those centuries fell upon him, and he aged instantly into a blind, ancient man. These are not simple adventure stories. They are profound metaphysical maps. They illustrate a cosmos with multiple, interpenetrating levels of existence. The otherworld was not a reward for the virtuous dead. It was a living, present reality for the spiritually aware or the magically fortunate. You could reach it through specific, liminal portals, the very same sites held sacred in daily practice. A Shia or fairy mound like the famous ones at Newgrange was not just a burial site. It was a doorway. A sudden mist on a hill, a deep forest pool, or a cave in a seaside cliff could serve as the veil, parting for a moment to allow passage. This belief did not die with the coming of Christianity. It simply transformed and found a new home in the vibrant tapestry of folklore. The majestic gods and goddesses of the old cycles diminished in scale but not in presence, becoming the Aos Shi, the people of the mounds, or as we commonly call them, the fairies. These were not the tiny, whimsical sprites of later children's tales. They were powerful, capricious, and deserved respect. They lived in a hidden world that mirrored our own, just out of sight, and their interactions with humanity followed strict, ancient rules. The survival of countless folk customs testifies to the enduring power of this concept. Farmers would leave a corner of their field untilled, the fairies' share, to avoid offending them. It was considered dangerous to build a house on a fairy path, and the reason you never thanked the fairies for a kindness was rooted in a very old logic. To give thanks was to acknowledge a debt settled, to end a relationship, but to stay in their debt was to maintain a connection, an ongoing bond with that other realm. This entire complex of belief is a direct inheritance from Druidic cosmology. The idea of a coexisting, accessible spiritual world fundamentally shaped how the Celts interacted with their environment. Every unusual rock formation, every lone hawthorn tree, every spring could be an entrance. This worldview survived not in philosophical texts, but in the cautionary tales told to children, in the respectful habits of farmers, and in the deep-seated feeling that the landscape is alive with unseen neighbors. It reminds us that for the Druids, and for the people who kept their whispers alive, magic was not a superstition, it was a geography. That geography of the unseen was anchored in a beautifully simple, yet profound, map of reality itself. At the heart of the Druidic cosmos was not a single heaven above, but a sacred trinity of interconnected realms: land, sea, and sky. This was the foundational triad upon which their entire philosophy was built, a holistic vision of existence that saw humanity not as a ruler of nature, but as a living bridge between these three great powers. We can glimpse this concept in countless aspects of Celtic culture, but perhaps nowhere more elegantly than in a symbol that has survived millennia: the triquetra. That interwoven, three-cornered knot you might recognize from ancient manuscripts or modern jewelry is far more than a decorative pattern. It is a perfect visual representation of this threefold world, each loop eternally flowing into the next, inseparable and equal, with no beginning and no end. To understand the Druids, we must step into this tripartite universe and feel its balance. The first realm, the land, was known in Old Irish as Domhin. This was the realm of the solid, the tangible, and the enduring. It represented stability, fertility, and the deep, silent wisdom of the ancestors. The land was not passive dirt. It was a living, breathing body. Its hills were its bones, its rivers its veins, and its soil the source of all nourishment. This is where the cycle of life, death, and rebirth played out in the fields and forests. The ancestors were not gone. They were part of this realm, their bones resting in the soil and their memories woven into the very topography of home. Rituals were grounded here literally. Offerings were buried, sacred stones were placed, and kings were inaugurated upon specific hills to marry their sovereignty to the land's enduring strength. To honor the land was to honor tradition, community, and the physical foundation of life itself. Flowing around and beneath the stability of the land was the second realm, the sea, or muir. But this concept encompassed all water, from the vast, storm-tossed ocean to the deepest forest well. If the land was solidity, the sea was fluidity. It represented emotion, intuition, the subconscious mind, and the soul's journey. Water is a shapeshifter, taking the form of its container, just as our feelings take the shape of our experiences. It is deep, often hidden, and holds mysteries in its darkness. The sea was the realm of dreams, of prophecy, and of transformation. To travel across water, whether on a physical voyage or in a vision quest, was to enter a state of change and potential danger. This is why so many portals to the otherworld were lakes, wells, or misty shores. These were points where the fluid, emotional realm of Muir breached the solidity of Domhin. Honoring this realm meant acknowledging the power of feeling, the importance of the inner life, and the courage required to navigate the unknown currents of fate. Arching over both land and sea was the third realm, the sky or Nem. This was the domain of intellect, spirit, vision, and the gods. The sky is boundless, luminous, and filled with patterns, the wheeling stars, the path of the sun, the ever-changing moon. It represented the higher mind, inspiration, and the cosmic order. The Druids, as astronomers, were the readers of this realm, deciphering the celestial language to guide their people. The gods and goddesses often operated from this sphere. They were expressed in thunder, lightning, and the gentle rain that connected sky to land. This realm was not distant or detached. It was the source of breath, of light, and of the divine spark within all living things. Rituals often reached upward, with fires lit on hilltops to mimic the stars, or prayers spoken into the wind. To honor the sky was to seek wisdom, to aspire, and to connect the human spirit with the vast, ordered beauty of the cosmos. This triad was not just a spiritual idea, it was the blueprint for society and the self. Celtic social structure famously divided into three functions: the Druids, who dealt with the sky, wisdom, and the gods; the warriors, who protected the land and its people; and the producers, the farmers and artisans, who nurtured the fertility of the land and crafted the goods of the material world. A healthy society, like a healthy cosmos, required balance between these three pillars. This worldview also shaped their deepest values. Truth was not a single fact, but a three-stranded cord. A promise had to be sworn by the land, the sea, and the sky to be binding. Personal fulfillment came from honoring all three realms within oneself, having the stability of the land, the depth of feeling of the sea, and the clarity of vision of the sky. The survival of this holistic view is everywhere once you know to look. It is in the persistent storytelling structure of triads, where wisdom comes in threes. It is in the enduring folk belief that you must respect the fairies of the land, the spirits of the wells, and the omens of the sky. It is in the very Celtic love for nature in its totality, not as a pretty backdrop, but as a sacred, three-layered communion. When you see that triquetra-knot, you are not just seeing an old design. You are looking at a philosophical diagram, a map of a universe where everything is connected, where human life is a dance between stability, emotion, and aspiration, forever held in a sacred, eternal knot. This threefold cosmos was governed by a single, supreme principle, the concept of truth. For the Druids, truth was far more than a moral suggestion about honesty. It was the very glue of reality, a sacred force known in Old Irish as fur. To speak truth was to align yourself with the cosmic order, to bring harmony between the realms of land, sea, and sky. To lie or to break an oath was not merely a social misstep. It was an act of spiritual violence, a crack in the foundation of the world that could bring misfortune to the entire community. This profound idea transforms every ethical choice from a personal decision into a cosmic responsibility. We can reconstruct the shape of this Druidic philosophy by looking at the legal and poetic texts of early Ireland, where the echoes of their judicial role survived longest. The Brehon Laws, a vast body of statutes written down between the 7th and 9th centuries by Christian jurists, are not Druidic law books. But like the old myths, they are built upon a foundation of much older tradition, preserving the social structures and restorative principles that the Druidic judges, or brithim, would have administered. Within these texts, we find a system not of punitive vengeance, but of complex, poetic justice designed to restore balance. At its heart was the concept of the honor price, or log and enich. Every person, from the highest king to the youngest child, had a precisely calculated worth, measured in cattle or other goods. This price reflected their social standing, but also their inherent dignity. If you injured someone, your penalty was not a jail cell, but the payment of their honor price to them and their family. The goal was not to inflict suffering upon the wrongdoer, but to repair the tear in the social fabric, to restore the honor that had been diminished. This focus on restitution over retribution feels like a direct inheritance from a wisdom tradition that valued cosmic harmony above all. The ethical world of the Druids, as glimpsed through later triads and tales, was built on pillars that supported this harmony. One of the greatest of these was hospitality. In a world of vast, wild landscapes and few settlements, to refuse shelter or food to a traveler was not just rude, it was a grave violation of fur. The stranger at your door could be a god in disguise, a poet carrying news, or simply a human soul in need. The duty of the host was absolute, to provide warmth, sustenance, and protection. In turn, the guest was bound by sacred obligation to bring no harm, to offer stories or news, and to depart without overstaying their welcome. This reciprocal bond was a microcosm of the social contract, a daily practice of maintaining balance between self and community. Alongside hospitality stood the warrior virtues of courage and loyalty, but these two were framed by truth. Courage was not blind aggression, it was the strength to stand for what was right, to defend the weak, and to face one's fate with clear eyes. Loyalty was the bond that held the tribe together, the unwavering commitment to one's chieftain and kin. But the most personal and mystical expression of truth was the jays, the sacred personal prohibition. As mentioned earlier, a jays was a taboo, often given at birth or during an initiation. It could be as specific as never eating the meat of a particular animal, or as broad as never refusing a request made by a poet. To break your jays was to unravel your own destiny. It was a violation of your personal truth, a step out of alignment with your ordained path in the cosmic order. The famous Irish hero Cuchulainn was under a jays never to eat dog meat, and another to never refuse hospitality. When he was offered a meal of dog by a group of witches, he was trapped in an impossible bind. To break one jays was to invite disaster. His tragic story illustrates how these prohibitions were not arbitrary rules, but spiritual compass needles, guiding an individual through a life in harmony with deeper forces. This intricate web of ethics, hospitality, honor, and personal truth paints a picture of a society deeply concerned with balance. The Druid, as judge and philosopher, would have been the keeper of this balance, interpreting the law, reminding the king of his duties, and ensuring that the actions of the people did not disturb the harmony of the three realms. Their legacy in the Brehon laws is not a list of their specific verdicts, but the enduring shape of their thinking, a legal philosophy that sought to heal rather than to harm, to compensate rather than to crush. In a world quick to anger and punishment, this surviving framework suggests a different path, one where justice was a form of restoration, and where every word spoken, every oath sworn, was a thread in the sacred tapestry of reality itself. That sacred tapestry of truth and memory found its final, formal sanctuary not in a forest grove, but in a thatched stone house. Long after the last Druid judged a case under an oak tree, the echo of their intellectual discipline lived on in the bardic schools of Ireland and Scotland. These were not casual gatherings of minstrels, but rigorous, institutional colleges that operated from the early medieval period, right up until the 17th century. Within their walls, a young man of suitable lineage would enter a world of intense mental discipline that would have felt hauntingly familiar to a Druidic initiate centuries before. His training was famously long, spanning 7, 9, or even 12 years. He lived in seclusion with his master and fellow students, and the curriculum was staggering in its scope and precision. He didn't just learn to rhyme, he mastered over 350 complex poetic meters, each with its own strict rules of syllable count, alliteration, and internal rhyme. He memorized the genealogies of every major family back through mythical time, absorbing the intricate Brehon legal statutes, and committing to memory the vast cycles of history and pseudo-history that defined his people's identity. This was the old Druidic model of the living library, now repurposed for a Christian society, but preserving the core belief that the highest knowledge was an oral, performative art, carried in the breath and the brain. The bard, or filly as he was known in Ireland, emerged from this training as a figure of immense social power. He was a walking repository of his culture's soul. At a king's court, he wasn't merely an entertainer, he was the legitimizer. His poems could cement a ruler's reputation for generations or destroy it with a satirical verse. His knowledge of genealogy could prove or disprove a noble's claim to land. His words were still believed to carry a tangible, almost magical force. A well-crafted praise poem could bring prosperity, while a curse, a glom-dyson, was feared as a weapon that could raise boils on the face of its target or blight their fortunes. This echoes the Druidic belief in the power of spoken truth and curse, the idea that language properly structured could alter reality itself. Though these poets were devout Christians, often trained by monastic scribes, their art remained stubbornly, gloriously native. They wrote and performed in Gaelic, using those ancient, intricate meters, and drawing on the deep well of pre-Christian mythology and symbolism. In their verses, the old gods became literary characters, the heroic cycles became national history, and the triadic patterns of thought continued. They were the crucial filter. When the early monastic scribes decided to write down the great myths like the Táin, it was often the trained poets who provided the oral versions, ensuring the stories were recorded with their proper rhythm and archaic dignity intact. Their schools were the last living link to the formal, graded learning system of the Druids, but this thread, stretched so thin across centuries, could not survive the political storms of the modern world. The final, devastating blow came with the expansion of English rule, particularly following the flight of the Earls in 1607 and the subsequent plantations. The Gaelic aristocratic order that had patronized and supported the bardic schools collapsed. The new English authorities saw the schools and the poets as threats, pillars of a rebellious native culture that needed to be broken. Laws were passed suppressing the profession, and the patronage that had sustained the rigorous training dried up. By the mid-17th century, the great schools were silent. The institutional lineage, the direct master-to-student chain that could be traced back into the misty past, was finally severed. Yet, in their final century, the poets performed one last, invaluable service. Sensing the end of their world, many began to write down not just the great epics, but the very technical knowledge of their craft. They transcribed the complex poetic meters, the legal glossaries, and the genealogies into manuscripts. These handwritten books, often passed down in families, became the treasure chests. They were no longer a living, breathing school, but they were a record. The lore was frozen on the page, a silent echo of the vibrant oral world that had sustained it for 2 millennia, waiting in dusty libraries for a future age to rediscover its rhythms and remember its secrets. Silence fell upon the bardic schools, but the hunger for their secrets did not. Centuries later, as the industrial age dawned, a powerful nostalgia swept through Britain and Europe. This was the Romantic era, a time of intense longing for a purer, more spiritual past seen as lost amidst the smoke of factories and the cold logic of the Enlightenment. People looked back with yearning to what they imagined were simpler, more heroic times, and in that gaze, the figure of the Druid was resurrected from the pages of old books. No longer feared as a pagan priest, he was reimagined as a noble philosopher of nature, a wise ancient Briton who embodied the soul of the wild, poetic landscape. This romantic hunger created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped one of the most fascinating and problematic figures in the entire story, a Welsh stonemason and poet named Edward Williams, who called himself Iolo Morgannwg. Iolo was a man of genuine learning and profound love for his native Wales, but he was also a consummate forger. Living in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, he was deeply immersed in the surviving manuscripts of Welsh poetry and history. He could read the old triads and the medieval lore, and he walked a land still rich with folk custom. But Iolo believed this heritage was fading, that it needed to be not just preserved, but actively rebuilt into a living tradition for a new age. So he set out to supply what history had failed to provide. With incredible creativity, he began to produce a stream of ancient documents, poems, and rituals that he claimed were the genuine, surviving works of the ancient Druids, passed down in secret through the generations. His most enduring invention was the gorset of the bards of the Isle of Britain. He created an elaborate, visually stunning ceremony, complete with a ceremonial stone circle, robes of white, blue, and green, and a ritual involving a sword, a horn, and a sheaf of corn. He even composed what is now famously known as the Druids' Prayer, Why Bedded. It is a beautiful, moving invocation that begins, "O God, give me strength to be just and truthful." Iolo presented all of this not as a new invention, but as the authentic restoration of a system that had existed since time immemorial. The critical analysis of his work is a study in paradox. On one hand, Iolo Morgannwg was undeniably a fraud. He fabricated texts, invented historical lineages, and passed off his own sublime poetry as the work of medieval bards. Scholars would later spend decades untangling his genuine forgeries from the authentic medieval material. Yet, to dismiss him entirely is to miss the deeper, more poignant truth of his legacy. Iolo did not create from nothing. He wove his tapestry from real threads. His forgeries were steeped in his deep, authentic knowledge of actual Welsh manuscript tradition, the triads, the genealogies, and the meter of the ancient poets. He incorporated elements of the folk customs he saw practiced in the Welsh countryside, the reverence for certain stones, the seasonal gatherings. His genius was in synthesis, in taking these scattered, fading fragments and assembling them into a coherent, dramatic, and emotionally powerful whole. His legacy, therefore, is profoundly paradoxical. He created a modern tradition built on a historical fiction, yet, in doing so, he accidentally achieved something remarkable. The gorset ceremonies, first held on Primrose Hill in London in 1792, and later incorporated into the very heart of the modern Welsh Eisteddfod cultural festival, created a tangible, participatory link to the past that people could feel. It revived public interest not just in his forgeries, but in the genuine ancient lore of Wales. By giving people a ritual to perform and a prayer to speak, he made the Druidic idea living again. He demonstrated the desperate, aching hunger of a people disconnected from their roots. A hunger so strong it was willing to embrace a beautiful fiction to feel a sense of continuity. In a strange way, Iolo Morganwg became the last and greatest of the bards, not by preserving a pure tradition, but by sensing the empty shelves in the Library of National Memory and writing new, compelling books to fill them, books that inspired others to go back and search for the original text. His work stands as a monument to the power of the story itself, proving that sometimes, the desire to believe in a lost wisdom can be the very force that ensures some part of it is never truly lost. Iolo Morganwg's romantic forgeries opened a door that many were eager to walk through. By the late 18th century, the fascination with ancient wisdom had crystallized into something more structured, giving rise to the first modern Druid orders. The most famous of these was the Ancient Order of Druids, founded in London in 1781. It is crucial to understand that this was not a pagan religious revival in the way we might think of it today. It was a fraternal, benevolent society, much like the Freemasons. Men gathered in lodges, wore ceremonial robes, used symbolic regalia, and participated in rituals that evoked the imagery of the ancient Druids as wise patriarchs. Their primary focus was mutual aid, charity, and fellowship in a rapidly industrializing world that often felt cold and impersonal. The ancient Druids provided a powerful symbol of unity, wisdom, and connection to a romanticized British past, a noble identity far removed from the grime of the factory. This fraternal model spread rapidly, with orders establishing themselves across Britain, Europe, and even in America. For over a century, modern Druidry largely existed in this social form, a club where the symbolism was ancient, but the purpose was contemporary camaraderie. Yet, the seed of something deeper had been planted. The robes, the rituals, and the very name invoked a spiritual longing that the fraternal structure could not fully contain. By the early 20th century, that seed began to sprout in a new direction. The old, comfortable image of the Druid as a bearded philosopher was about to be infused with a potent new energy, the modern revival of nature-based paganism. This transformation was led by two pivotal figures, one a poet and scholar, the other the founder of a new witchcraft tradition. In Britain, a man named Ross Nichols, a poet and historian deeply involved with the old Druid fraternal orders, grew dissatisfied. He felt the orders had become stale, focused more on ceremony than on any genuine spiritual connection to the land or the Celtic heritage they claimed to honor. In 1964, he broke away to found his own group, which would later become the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids. Nichols was deeply influenced by his friend Gerald Gardner, the man who had publicly launched Wicca, the modern pagan witchcraft tradition, just a decade earlier. From Gardner, Nichols saw how a new spiritual path could be woven from historical fragments, folk practices, and inspired ritual creation. He blended this inventive approach with his own profound love for Celtic mythology and the poetic cycles of the year. Nichols didn't just want to dress up as a Druid, he wanted to walk a Druid path. He re-emphasized the threefold division of Bard, Ovate, and Druid as stages of spiritual learning and service. He wove the eightfold Wheel of the Year, popularized by Gardnerian Wicca, which included the 4 solar festivals and the 4 Celtic fire festivals, into a coherent Druidic ritual calendar. This was a revolutionary synthesis. It took the skeletal framework recovered from history, the festival calendar from folklore, and the ritual techniques from the modern pagan revival, and breathed new life into them. The Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, and groups like it that followed, represent a conscious and honest endeavor in spiritual reconstruction. They openly acknowledge the gaps in the historical record. No one claims to have a secret, unbroken lineage back to Iron Age priests. Instead, they see themselves as gardeners tending a very old, fragmented orchard. Some trees are ancient stumps, barely alive, their roots still deep in the soil of history and archaeology. Others are new saplings, grown from the seeds of those old stumps, but shaped by the light of contemporary spiritual needs. The practice is a living collage. A ritual might incorporate a meditation on an ogham few from a medieval manuscript, a chant inspired by a Welsh poem, an offering made at a local spring in the old way, and a discussion of ecological ethics drawn from modern science. The goal is not to recreate a museum exhibit of the past, but to build a bridge. It is to use those surviving fragments, the poetry, the seasonal cycles, the reverence for nature, as a foundation for a meaningful spiritual life today. This is a tradition that looks backward with respect, but lives firmly in the present, asking what it means to be a druid in an age of climate change and digital disconnect. It seeks the flowing inspiration, not just in old books, but in the wind through the trees outside your window, in the creative act of writing a poem, or in the simple, sacred act of tending a garden. The modern druid is, in many ways, a seeker at a new kind of threshold, piecing together a map from ancient clues, and setting out once more into the living, speaking landscape. This living collage of practice finds its heartbeat in the turning of the sacred year. For a modern druid, the calendar is not a grid on a wall, but a circular path walked with reverence, a ritual map known as the Wheel of the Year. It weaves together the four great solar points, the solstices and equinoxes acknowledged by ancient builders, with the four Gaelic fire festivals of Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnisad that marked the agricultural cycle. This eight-spoked wheel is a modern synthesis, but each spoke taps into a deep, historical wellspring, celebrating the winter solstice, or Alban Arthan as some traditions name it, is not merely about the shortest day. It is a vigil for the reborn sun, a time of inner reflection held in the deepest dark, often marked by storytelling and the kindling of a central candle whose light is shared to all. The summer solstice, Alban Hefin, becomes a celebration of peak light and life, a time for joy, community gathering, and often a dawn pilgrimage to a sacred site like Stonehenge to greet the sun. The equinoxes, moments of perfect balance between day and night, are times for planting intentions at spring or giving thanks for the harvest at autumn. And the cross-quarter fire festivals are infused with the old folk customs, the ancestors honored at Samhain, the first stirrings welcomed at Imbolc, the fires of passion lit at Beltane, and the gratitude of the first harvest shared at Lugnisad. Through this rhythmic practice, the participant does not just read about the druidic reverence for nature's cycles, they embody it. They feel the years ebb and flow in their bones, creating a personal, lived connection to the cosmic principles the ancients observed. This connection is deepened daily through a practice as simple as it is profound, meditation in nature. It is called many things, sitting out, or ditchiel, a dedicated attunement. It is not about emptying the mind in a sterile room, but about filling the senses in a living one. A practitioner might find a quiet spot under an old tree, by a stream, or even in a city park. The goal is to be still and to listen, not with the ears alone, but with the whole being. To notice the way the light filters through the leaves, the pattern of bark under the fingertips, the scent of damp earth after rain, and the complex symphony of bird calls and insect hum. This is not passive relaxation, it is active reciprocity. It is the practice of building a relationship with the other than human persons of that place, the tree, the stone, the spirit of the spring. In this quiet space, the boundaries between self and landscape soften. The modern seeker begins to experience the world not as a collection of objects, but as a community of subjects, a direct encounter with the animistic heart of the old Celtic worldview. This sensory immersion becomes the foundation for all other study, grounding abstract lore in the tangible, breathing reality of the present moment. That study often leads to the ogham, the tree alphabet. In contemporary Druidry, the ogham is not used for writing messages, but as a spiritual and psychological toolkit. Each of the 20 primary feta, or letters, is a gateway. To study the birch Beaith is to explore themes of new beginnings, purification, and potential. Its poetic kenning, most silver of skin, invites meditation on innocence and resilience. The oak dare invites contemplation of strength, sovereignty, and steadfast truth. By learning the tree lore, the medicinal properties, the mythological associations, and the seasonal correspondences of each few, the practitioner builds a rich, symbolic language. They might draw a single ogham few from a bag each morning as a focus for the day's meditation, or use the full set for personal reflection and problem solving, seeing in the tree's qualities mirrors for their own inner landscape. This practice directly channels the ancient Phylid's use of the ogham as a mnemonic system for a vast body of natural wisdom. It transforms a walk in the woods into a conversation with old teachers, making the abstract concept of sacred knowledge immediate and personal. The forest becomes a living library, and the ogham is its index. The ultimate goal of these practices, from the wheel to the woodland meditation, is to cultivate on. This Welsh word meaning flowing inspiration is the Druidic concept for that moment of transcendent connection, when a spark of divine insight or creative fury flashes into the mind. It is the breath of the gods, the fire in the head that animated the ancient bards and seers. Modern Druids seek this not as a rare, dramatic event, but as a regular state of mindful openness. They court on through the beauty of ritual, the discipline of poetic study, the stillness in nature, and the practice of any creative art, from music to painting to gardening. When on flows, it is experienced as a deep sense of rightness, a feeling of being in alignment with a larger pattern, and often a surge of clarity or a compelling creative impulse. This pursuit ties the entire spiritual endeavor together. It answers the question of why celebrate the seasons, why learn the tree lore, why sit in silence. The answer is to polish the mirror of the self, to clear away the clutter of the mundane, so that it might better reflect the illuminating spark of the world's soul. In seeking on, the modern Druid steps into the role of the filly and the ovate, becoming a channel for the wisdom that whispers through the land. Of course, this entire revival exists under the shadow of a legitimate scholarly critique, often called the invention of tradition. Historians rightly point out that the eightfold wheel, the three-grade system of bard, ovate, and druid, and the specific rituals used are modern creations. There is no continuous, unbroken line of practice from Iron Age groves to today's woodland ceremonies. This criticism is important, and most thoughtful Druids acknowledge it openly. They agree they are not reconstructing a lost religion with perfect fidelity, because such a feat is impossible. Instead, they are engaged in something perhaps more meaningful. They are reimagining. They are taking the philosophical principles and ecological insights they believe are embedded in the fragments, the reverence for nature, the love of wisdom, the pursuit of inspiration, and the sense of sacred community, and they are giving them functional, beautiful form for a contemporary world. The rituals may be new, but the soil they are planted in is ancient. The celebration of the solstice connects to a human impulse as old as our species, to mark the sun's return. The meditation under a tree honors a sense of the sacred in nature that predates all organized religion. The study of ogham engages with a genuine, historical system of thought. In this light, the invention is not a forgery, but a necessary act of translation. It is how a dormant seed, preserved in the frozen ground of folklore and manuscript, is finally warmed by a new sun and encouraged to grow again, not as an identical copy of the parent plant, but as a living, adaptive expression of its essential genetic code. This modern spirituality, with all its creative adaptations, becomes the latest, and perhaps most vital, vessel for the secret knowledge's survival. It ensures that the whispers of the oak, the rhythm of the seasons, and the quest for on are not just subjects for historical documentaries, but are living currents in the human search for meaning, rooted once more in the animate earth. The most vital secret to survive is not a ritual, but a way of seeing. Woven through every fragment we have traced, from the sacred well to the whispering tree, is a single, profound thread, the animistic worldview. This is the belief that the natural world is not a collection of inert resources, but a living, conscious community. For the Druids, every oak had a spirit, every spring housed a goddess, and every hill was a sleeping giant. This was not a poetic metaphor, but a functional reality that dictated how they lived. This perspective, preserved in the cautionary tales of fairy folk, the personification of rivers in poetry, and the enduring sacredness of certain places, may be their greatest gift to our time. It prefigures the very heart of modern deep ecology, which argues that the Earth is not a machine for human use, but a complex, interconnected web of life in which we are one strand among many. The old stories that warned against angering the spirit of a forest by cutting too many trees, or polluting a sacred spring, encoded an ancient ecological ethic in the language of spiritual consequence. This was a knowledge system that understood sustainability not as a policy, but as a sacred covenant. Their reverence was hyper-local and specific. They did not worship nature in the abstract. They formed relationships with the particular, the ancient yew in the churchyard, the salmon in that river, the ravens on that cliff. This fostered a profound sense of place and responsibility. You would not poison the well from which you drank and in which the local goddess resided. You would not recklessly clear the grove where the ancestors whispered. This intimate, relational knowledge created a blueprint for living within ecological limits, enforced not by law, but by reverence and a tangible fear of spiritual backlash. In our age of climate crisis and mass extinction, this shift in perception is not a historical curiosity. It is an urgent necessity. Modern environmental science gives us the data, the graphs of rising temperatures and declining species. It tells us the what and the how of our planetary crisis, but the Druidic legacy, carried in folklore and felt in the landscape, offers the why. It answers the question of motivation on a soul-deep level. Why should we care for a river? Because it is alive. Why should we protect a forest? Because it is a community we belong to, not a commodity we own. This animistic perspective transforms conservation from a burden into a sacrament, an act of maintaining right relationship with our more than human kin. The survival of this knowledge is quiet but persistent. You hear it in the language of those who fight to protect old-growth forests, describing them as cathedrals. You see it in the movement to grant legal personhood to rivers, recognizing them as living entities with rights, just as the Celts once saw the river Boyne as the goddess Bone. You feel it in the simple, growing desire to reconnect with the land, to know the names of the trees and the birds again. This is not a revival of ancient religion, but a reawakening of an ancient mode of consciousness, one that remembers the world speaks. The secret that survived is not a list of spells or a calendar of festivals, though those are its vessels. It is the radical, animistic heartbeat within them all, the understanding that the earth is sacred, sentient, and full of persons, only some of whom are human. In a world often seen as dead matter waiting to be used, this surviving thread is a lifeline, a way of seeing that could guide us home. That animistic map was not lost, it was simply written in a different language. Long after the last formal ritual was performed, the landscape itself kept the secrets, whispering warnings and marking territories through the quiet, persistent language of folklore and place names. This is where the survival becomes almost invisible, woven into the fabric of everyday life. Consider the fairy fort, known in Ireland as a rath. These are circular earthen mounds, often overgrown with thorn trees, that dot the countryside. To an archaeologist, they are the remains of an Iron Age farmstead or a ring fort. But to the local people for centuries, they were something else entirely, the homes of the Ogham-symbols, the powerful fairy folk. A dense body of folklore grew around them, strict and unforgiving. It was forbidden to cut down the trees on a rath, to disturb its soil, or to build upon it. To do so was to invite catastrophic bad luck, sickness, or the disappearance of your livestock. This was not mere superstition, it was a highly effective conservation covenant. The taboo, enforced by fear of supernatural retribution, protected these ancient sites from being plowed over or quarried for stone. The stories acted as a cultural immune system, identifying and safeguarding places of deep historical and likely ancient spiritual significance. The same protective lore clung to lone hawthorn trees, especially those growing on a rath or at a crossroads. The hawthorn was sacred, often seen as a fairy tree. To cut one down was an act of profound folly. There are countless tales from the 19th and even 20th centuries of road workers or farmers who felled a lone thorn, only to suffer broken machinery, sudden illness, or financial ruin until they made amends, sometimes by replanting the tree. These stories were passed down as cautionary tales, ensuring that even in an age of modernization and skepticism, a lingering respect, a hesitation remained. That hesitation preserved the tree, and by extension, preserved the invisible sanctity of the place it marked. Standing stones, those silent monoliths in fields, were treated with similar reverence. They were said to move at midnight to drink from a stream, or to be petrified giants or witches. You did not interfere with them. This web of folklore created an informal but powerful heritage protection scheme, maintained not by government decree, but by the collective memory and whispered warnings of the community. It was a way of saying, this place is different, this place is alive, leave it be, and for the most part people listened. This oral map was reinforced by the very names on the land. Place names are often the oldest historical records we have, fossilized poetry that can reveal a landscape's forgotten character. Across Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Cornwall, the geography is dotted with names that are cryptic signposts to a sacred past. Take the Irish word dreet, meaning magic or enchantment. It finds its way into place names like Magaradraft in County Londonderry, which may mean the plain of the Druid or the plain of enchantment. Simply hearing that name, generation after generation, would subtly reinforce the idea that this particular patch of ground was touched by the otherworldly. Then there is the potent term nemeton, the Celtic word for a sacred grove or sanctuary. It appears across the Celtic world, from Nemetabriga in Spain to Medion Meton in Scotland. In Britain, the city of Vernemetum meant the great or alder sanctuary. While these classical names evolved, the concept they represented lingered. A grove might be cleared, but if the name of the field or hill retained the echo of Nemeton, it preserved the memory that this was once holy ground, a place set apart. Perhaps the most pervasive and telling survival is the word Shia. In Irish mythology, the Shia are the hollow hills, the dwelling places of the gods who later became the fairies. This word is embedded in hundreds of place names. Knocknashee in County Sligo means the hill of the fairies. Sheehan in County Tyrone translates simply as the fairy mound. In Scotland, the variant Sith appears in names like Scythian Moor, the big fairy hill. Every time a farmer referred to the field by the Shee, or a traveler passed Knocknashee, they were unconsciously acknowledging the invisible geography of the otherworld. They were reaffirming that this hill was not just a hill, it was a portal, a place belonging to another order of beings. These names acted as permanent labels, ensuring that even if the stories faded, the map remained legible to those who knew how to read it. The landscape became a palimpsest, a parchment where the old sacred writing showed through beneath the newer Christian or practical names. A modern town might be called New Town, but the old fort on its outskirts is still called the Fairy Fort. A field might be known as the Priest's Meadow now, but an older record might list it as the Druid's Field. This layering is a record of continuous, if transformed, recognition. So what was the function of this cryptic, enduring map? It served as a cultural memory, a way of storing vital information about the landscape's spiritual ecology outside of books and far beyond the reach of institutional change. The folklore warned people away from places of concentrated power, or taught them how to interact with those places respectfully, through offerings or avoidance. The place names marked them for what they were. Together, they preserved a sacred geography long after the original priests who consecrated it were gone. The knowledge survived not as a doctrine to be preached, but as a story to be told and a name to be remembered. It became part of the practical wisdom of living in that land. You learned where not to build, which trees not to cut, which wells could heal and which mounds were best left undisturbed. This was not a religion, it was a relationship, maintained through narrative and nomenclature. It meant that a child growing up in rural Ireland 200 years ago, who might never have heard the word druid, still knew that the old thorn tree on the fort was not to be touched, and that the hill with the fairy name was to be passed in quiet respect. In that knowing, in that hesitation before the ancient and the strange, the deepest secret of all was kept alive, the understanding that the land is not ours, we are part of it, and some parts of it hum with a memory and a presence that asks for our silence. The map was always there, written in the stories of the elders and the names on the stones, waiting for a time when its contours might be understood once more, not as superstition, but as a guide to walking gently on an earth that never forgot how to speak. But this map of whispers and names leads us to a quiet, unavoidable crossroads. How much of this recovered wisdom is truly ancient, and how much is our own longing reflected back at us? To walk this path honestly, we must confront the silence at its heart. The greatest challenge is the stark absence of their own voice. The Druids left no scriptures, no diaries, no first-hand accounts of their rituals or beliefs. Everything we think we know comes filtered through other lenses, often from those who saw them as enemies or curiosities. The Roman writers like Julius Caesar, Tacitus, and Pliny provide our most detailed accounts, but their perspective is profoundly biased. Caesar was a general writing to justify a conquest, portraying the Druids as powerful leaders who needed to be eliminated for political control. Pliny saw them through a naturalist's eye, fascinated but often sensationalizing their practices. Their descriptions, while invaluable, are like reading about a culture solely through the reports of its invaders, colored by political motive and cultural misunderstanding. Then came the Christian scribes of the early medieval period. When they finally wrote down the old Irish and Welsh myths, they were preserving stories they likely viewed as the noble history of their people, but also as the superstitions of a pagan past. They were not neutral anthropologists. Elements that conflicted with Christian doctrine might be softened, omitted, or reinterpreted. A goddess of sovereignty might be demoted to a fairy queen. A ritual of rebirth might become a simple adventure tale. The texts we rely on, like the Mabinogion or the Ulster Cycle, are therefore palimpsests, sacred stories written over with a new faith's handwriting, where the original ink shows through in tantalizing, fragmented glimpses. This creates a fundamental dilemma. We are trying to reconstruct a complex philosophy from enemy propaganda and the folklore recorded by a successor religion centuries after the fact. It is an archaeological dig where the most precious artifacts are made of memory and metaphor, not stone and bone. Into this silence, the modern world has eagerly spoken. The 19th century, with its waves of romanticism and rising nationalism, recast the Druid in a new image. No longer the feared pagan of Roman reports, he became the noble ancient philosopher, the original patriot, the pure spiritual ancestor of the British or Celtic nation. This romanticized figure, often depicted in white robes at Stonehenge, was more a mirror of the era's desires than a historical reality. It was a projection, a need for a deep, untainted, native roots in a time of disruptive industrialization and empire. This romantic impulse directly fueled the creative forgeries of ILO Morganug and the fraternal orders, blending genuine fragments with invented tradition to create a usable past. Today, the neo-pagan synthesis continues this creative process. Modern druidry and related paths openly weave together those historical fragments, folk customs, and inspired new ritual to meet contemporary spiritual needs. This is not deception. It is a conscious and often transparent act of spiritual creativity. But it does raise a poignant question for the seeker. Where does respectful reconstruction end and creative invention begin? Is there a line, and does it matter? The answer may lie in intention. When invention is presented as discovered historical fact, it clouds the waters of understanding. But when it is offered as a living response to the essence of what survived, as a way to make those ancient whispers audible again, it becomes a different kind of truth. It becomes a conversation across time, rather than a claim of unbroken lineage. We are not restoring a shattered vase with all its original pieces. We are gathering the ceramic dust and beautiful shards we can find and crafting a new vessel that can still hold water. The old vase is gone, but the need to carry the water, the thirst for connection, remains. So after this long journey through stones, stories, and seasons, what can we say with any certainty? We may never know the specific chance at a solstice dawn, or the exact curriculum of a 20-year initiation. The full picture is lost, and yet, the persistent, coherent echoes are undeniable. They resonate across different channels, creating a harmony that is more than coincidence. The sacred triad of land, sea, and sky appears in cosmology, social structure, and oath-swearing. The reverence for trees echoes from ogham-kennings to the taboo of the fairy thorn. The ritual calendar of fire festivals survived conquest and conversion to shape our very holidays. The landscape itself is annotated with names and stories that guard its ancient sanctity. These are not isolated fragments. They are pieces of a single, shattered mosaic. When you put them together, a pattern emerges, not of specific dogmas, but of a profound orientation toward the world. It suggests a people who experience reality as alive, interconnected, and sacred. They saw wisdom in the cycles of nature, truth in the balance of realms, and inspiration as a divine flow to be cultivated. This essence, this animistic, holistic, and poetic worldview, is what trickled down. It seeped into the ballads, hid in the nursery rhymes, and shaped the quiet customs of the countryside. It is the reason a well feels peaceful, an old forest feels wise, and the 1st of May still feels magically alive. The secret druidic knowledge that survived then is not a locked book of spells. It is a key, a way of perceiving. It is the lingering sense that the world is not a dead machine, but a living community. That the past is not gone, but sleeping in the land, waiting for us to listen. We may have lost their words, but we have inherited their grammar, a way of seeing that could teach us, once more, how to belong to the world, rather than simply own it. The map of whispers was never meant to be complete. Our journey ends not with a grand revelation, but with a quiet understanding. The secret druidic knowledge did not survive in a single, locked book or a hidden vault. It could not be captured that way. Instead, it shattered into 1,000 brilliant fragments, each one carried forward on a different current of time. It survived in the relentless rhythm of the bardic line, a poetic meter that held history intact. It hid in the old names for trees, each one a key to a world of meaning. It kept time in the eternal turning of the seasonal wheel, in the fires of Beltane and the quiet of Samhain. It waited in the patient silence of a stone circle, aligned to a cosmos it no longer needs to explain. And it lived most powerfully in the simple stories told by the hearth, tales of fairy forts and sacred wells that taught generations how to walk respectfully upon a living earth. This knowledge did not endure by accident. Its very survival, across 2 millennia of conquest and conversion, is a testament to its raw, adaptive power and its deep, human relevance. It answered a need too fundamental to be erased, the need to belong to a world that speaks. So what now? The invitation is simple, yet it changes everything. Look at your own landscape with new eyes. That oddly shaped hill on the horizon, that ancient tree in the park, that old local name for a field or a lane. What stories might they hold? Listen to the old family tales, the quirky superstitions about certain plants or places. They are not just quaint nonsense, they are often the last echoes of a much older conversation. What ancient wisdom might still be whispering beneath the noise of the modern world, waiting only for someone to pause and hear it. The fragments are all around us, in the land, in the language, in the turning of the year. The secret was never truly lost, it was only forgotten how to listen. We would love to hear in the comments below, what fragments of old knowledge have you encountered in your own life or landscape? Share your stories, and if you want to join us for more deep dives into the hidden corners of esoteric history,